Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Gabriel and today we'll be painting the Bolton Bastard Girls. So this paint job is going to be relatively quick and easy one. We're just using an artificial brush and quite a large one just to block in the major areas. And I chose to follow the paint scheme that the cover art on the box laid out, so a very pale color. It appears slightly blue because of the colors I've mixed in, but it's basically going to be a white to gray. But you should use off-white and off-black and maybe mix in a little bit of red or yellow or blue depending on what kind of gray you want. And right now, we're not worried about texture. We're not worried about anything besides just kind of getting a nice transition. And so we'll do this a couple times of starting off with a bright kind of highlight color, so that we're going to just focus that, the top of the head, the back, the sides a little bit. Then we're going to be working in darker and darker colors until we get a nice, somewhat smooth transition from the top all the way to the darker underbelly. And this is just going to be kind of monochromatic fur that's being affected by where the light is hitting it. You can see how I'm taking very large, heavy strokes, and I'm just essentially just marking out where I want the colors to be, and the fine tuning comes later. I found this is actually a nice technique, even if I'm working on higher standard models. It's just very, very easy to have a simple guide to go through where you're using thin paint and you're just building up where the colors are and then carefully focusing down the specific regions. So you can see how I'm going past where the highlights are, then I'm using the midtone to work the colors back up, and essentially this is creating a very nice, roughly smooth transition, which is what we want for a tabletop quality. Now to create the actual fur texture, I experimented using a small brush, just creating little fur locks, but I decided that would be way too time consuming for the standard we're going to. So I'm somewhat dry brushing, somewhat over brushing the model. And essentially you can see how all these strands are coming out. That's because when you work in some pigment, then when you work it out, you get a bunch of individual hairs, and you can see this very well right now. And essentially they're all creating their own individual stroke, and this allows you to have a very quick and dirty fur texture, which won't be as apparent in the darker areas. So we're just kind of using that to highlight and smooth those upper regions, maybe using a slightly darker color on those lower sections and not really worrying too much about the darker, the very dark underbelly area. you can see how that texture is starting to show up. Here I'm better defining the smaller volumes on the dog, the various bones, muscles, and creases. They're somewhat apparent from the lighting and just the rough blend we've been doing, but the problem is, viewing it from a distance away is going to be very hard to actually notice. And so we're going to be increasing that contrast because of how well defined it is on the sculpt. It should be well defined. And so you can see this might seem very harsh, but just with a little bit of blending, you can get a very, very nice and clear idea of what kind of shapes are on the dog's body, and that will really help you out versus just leaving it subtle and looking very flat. Here I'm marking out where we're going to be adding some flesh colors later on, as well as just getting those final shadows. Here I'm adding a final layer of highlights, and that's just to emphasize certain regions on the dog, like the head and the shoulder areas. And now I'm starting to add in a little fleshy color. So I'm using a Bugman's Glow, but you can use whatever kind of reddish flesh color you want. And I'm just adding that to the eyes, the ears, and then a little bit on the nose and mouth as well. And that's just to bring out that little bit of those hints of flesh, you could say, that kind of show. And if you have the cover art, well, you can always Google it, but I find that's a very good guide for how to place those flesh colors. And then here I'm adding some extra detail. This is after you've pretty much finished painting the fur. I'm just using that flesh color to create some thin lines across the body, and that's just to replicate scars and things like that. So places where the dog was bitten or cut or something, the fur hasn't grown back because it's scar tissue, and then you have those little exposed areas. It might not be completely realistic, but it gives your little mean doggo some extra dimension and creates kind of that feeling of a violent creature. And then I'm using an even redder color to go back in to those fleshy parts I talked about earlier, the eyes, the ears, the mouth, and then I'm also going over the scars slightly where the scratches and cuts might be fresher. And here I'm just reinforcing that color. And now I'm doing a messy technique where you have some thin reddish kind of blood looking color, and I'm basically just flicking the paint onto the model, and this gives a very nice fine spray. Just be aware that you shouldn't have anything that you don't want paint on it behind it, because it's just going to get hit by the spray, even if you think it's not going to get hit by the spray. But you can see it just adds that extra little piece of violence there. Now I'm adding in some darker color to the nose here, just to kind of finish off the shape and better define it. And now I'm using pretty much a pure black to dot in the eyes. I thought it would give kind of like a bloodshot look, and the black eyes I think kind of dehumanize the dogs a bit, which is a little ironic, but we're also just using that to touch the feet. Most of it's going to be pretty dirty and kind of like weathered, so you don't have to be too careful. Now I'm using a blue brown, which is pretty much like a kind of a dark gray brown sort of color. I'm just very carefully marking in the dog collar. And now I'm just using a little bit of regular metallic. This is P3 pig iron, but you could use like a lead belcher or some kind of like somewhat shiny steel color. Nothing very bright or nothing too dark, just to kind of give it a bit of pop on the little rivets or little spikes, whatever they are, on the leash, and also the little buckle. And wherever you mess up, just take a wet brush and wipe it off. Well, that's about it for this video. I thought the pale fur on the dogs would be an interesting challenge, but turned out to be pretty straightforward. Basically, you get a nice kind of grayscale going of light to dark, but without adding that fur texture, by just like using the bristles of the brush to create just these like mix of lines and streaks. It's really not going to look like natural fur. So that's an essential part to making this successful. And then adding in those extra details, you could even add in some flesh colors to tint some sections of the dog if you like, but overall very simple and rewarding paint job. At least that's how I found it. And just to note quickly, I didn't paint the Houndmasters because they have pretty much the same scheme as the other Bolton figures, so you can check out my other video for that. Well, that about wraps it up for this one, so stay happy, stay healthy, keep painting.